Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 3. Let us read out the question carefully. Discuss the criteria adopted to demarcate coastal regulation zone in India. Briefly discuss the recommendations of the Shailesh Nayak Committee on coastal regulation zone. Before we even attempt answering this question, we have to make a special caution here that this is going to be a very important lecture today, because as you can see, this is a technical type of question. That is, this question requires some specific knowledge if you can at all, even you could say, manage to answer this question. Unlike the other questions in general studies, which you can answer with some basic common sense, this question actually requires some, you could say, knowledge specific to the topic that this question raises. So pay great attention here. So pay all your attention to this lecture. Anyway, we are introducing our answer with making important observation about the coastline of India. That is, India has a coastline of more than 7,500 kilometers, and more than 250 million people live along the coasts, with the vibrant economies of the coast supporting megapolises, that is the megapolitan cities of Mumbai, Chennai, Surat, Kochi, Visakhapatnam, etc. The coastal zone is vital to the economy, serving as entrepot to the vast hinterland. Entrepot actually means it's a fashionable term for entry port. That is, the coastal zone, it houses the seaports which connect the hinterland, that is the landlocked central part of the country, to the you could say to the coasts, connecting the latter, that is the hinterland, with ports, and integrating the economy into global trade. So we can say that the coastal region plays this role of integrating the economy into the global economy through trade. That is why it is imperative, that is absolute necessary, that steps are taken to protect the coastal ecosystem. The coastal ecosystem and its constituents like mangroves, mudflats, coastal lagoons, etc., perform vital functions. Some of which are, to mention just one, acting as breakwaters to storms, cyclones, and tsunamis. They also host unique biodiversity, serving as breeding grounds for aquatic species. So you can understand some of the, you could say, unique ecosystems that the coastal zone houses include mangroves, mudflats, coastal lagoons. One of the examples of coastal lagoons in India would be Chilika Lake, or for that matter, some of the backwater lakes of the backwater lakes of Kerala. These you could say constituents of the coastal ecosystem perform very important function, one of which is acting as breakwaters to some of the, you could say, natural hazards, or these you could say these ecosystems actually stop these hazards from turning into disasters. They actually, it has been observed that these, you could say, the mangroves, or for that matter mud flats, the lagoons, etc., these can actually act as breakwaters to events like cyclones, storms, or for that matter even the tsunamis. During the 2004 tsunamis, it was observed that the coastal zone that had mangroves was less affected. It was mostly protected from the tsunamis. Now, taking the importance of coastal ecosystem in mind, the coastal regulation zone was first proposed in 1991 to protect the coast. The CRG is demarcated, that is the coastal regulation zone is demarcated in relation to low tide line and the high tide line reached by the spring tide. Spring tide is the day when the sun and the moon are aligned perfectly. Actually, they appear to be in one line, and that means that the gravitational pull is it is the you could say strongest on the day of the spring tide. Anyway, the point is it is the high tide level and the low tide level reached on the spring tide that is taken as the benchmark for demarcating the coastal regulation zone. Accordingly, the CRG covers coastal zone 500-meter inland landward from HTL and the zone between HTL and between the LTL, that is the low tide line, and the high tide line. We would repeat it. The CRG, that is the coastal regulation zone, covers the coastal zone 500-meter inland, that is landward from the high tide line, and the entire zone between the low tide line and the high tide line. So what are the, you could say, criteria that has been used by the coastal regulation zoning of 2011? This regulation, the 2011 regulation, they divide the zone, the coastal regulation zone, among, you could say, 4 zones. What are these zones? First is zone 1, which encompasses the ecological sensitive area like reefs, mangroves, biosphere reserves, etc. No construction activity is permitted in the CRG1. We would repeat it. No construction activity is permitted in the CRG1, that is the zone 1 of CRG, because it is considered ecologically sensitive and encompasses reefs, mangroves, biosphere reserves, etc. Then comes the zone 2. It may have some built up area like villages, towns, etc. Some building is permitted landward. Activities like desalination plants, etc. are allowed. Then talking of zone 3, it is relatively undisturbed area. No development zone between 200 meter from the high tide line, that is this zone encompasses a no development zone 200 meter landward from the high tide line, and in the 200 meter to 500 meter zone of high tide line, some activity like building housing, tourism infrastructure, etc. is allowed. Coming to zone 4, please note that the zone 4 encompasses Andaman and Nicobar, Lakshadweep, etc. That is the island territories of India. It encompasses the entire territorial water of the country, that is the 12 nautical miles from the low tide line. And here what is permitted? Some traditional activities like fishing, etc. are permitted in the zone 4. We would repeat it. The zone 4 encompasses the island territory of India, and it covers the 12 nautical miles zone from the low tide line. Some activity which is permitted in zone 4 is traditional fishing actually. Elaborating on these points, CRG, that is the coastal regulation zoning, aims to balance protection of environment around the coast with, you could say, the need of development, economic development. The most vulnerable zone 1 is sensitive to slightest disturbance. This zone is accorded most protection, as you can understand very well, because it is ecologically sensitive. It is accorded most protection and tried to be preserved undisturbed, that is very few activities are permitted here. The other zones offer greater leeway, permitting residential and infrastructure developments. Zone 4, what is specific about zone 4 is that zone 4 is sensitive not only to ecological, you could say, restrictions, but also to unique anthropology of India's island territory. That is, they house the unique tribes of India's island territory, Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep, and provide protection to tribal marine economy like activities like fishing. We have already talked about that the Zone 4 permits very few activities including the traditional fishing, etc. Now coming to the Shailesh Nayak Committee, which was set up to balance the imperatives of economic development and protecting the coastal ecosystem. Actually, in real life, it's always a challenge to balance these two things, to balance the need of economic development as well as environmental protection. We would repeat it: the specific objective, the you could say the explicit objective of the Shailesh Nayak Committee was to make recommendations to balance the twin needs of protecting the coastal ecosystem as well as ensuring economic development. The Nayak Committee recommendations include: it recommended making exceptions for strategic purposes like defense facilities, nuclear energy installations, etc. Actually, this is a carry forward from the 2011 regulations. Even the 2011 regulations had these provisions. Shailesh Nayak Committee is more explicit about the exceptions granted to strategic purposes. The committee recommended narrowing the definition of the no development zone as 200-meter from the HTL. Please recall that it was 500-meter in the CRG regulations of 2011. Nayak Committee recommended allowing fisheries, tourism, harbour facilities, etc. in the CRG and reclamation in CRG 4. Actually, the erstwhile Zone 4 was quite restrictive, but the Shailesh Nayak Committee, it especially refers to the experience of countries like Singapore, which have, you could say, quite successfully reclaimed some land, and they have done this reclamation with much less footprint, much less ecological footprint. So they are saying, the Shailesh Nayak Committee is recommending that India too should permit some form of land reclamation in Andaman and Nicobar, Lakshadweep, etc. The committee recommended restricting the role of center to projects requiring environmental clearance and devolving regulations to states and local bodies. So they are specifically claiming for restricting the role of the central government and like bestowing most of these you could say regulatory functions on the local bodies or the state governments, etc. This was all on coastal regulation zone and the recommendations made by the Shailesh Nayak Committee. One more point that we would like to add here, that the Shailesh Nayak Committee recommendations have been notified by the 2018 regulations, CRG, you could say regulations. So this is, you could say, the most recent, the newest CRG regulations which were notified in 2018. This is all for today. We would bring you another lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.